My apology. This this coming Saturday, the 11th, is the date for our second Saturday family bird walk. If you've always, if you feel like a beginning birder or you want to bring the family, including some kids, 9 to 11 at Turtle Bay this coming Saturday, October 11th. On Saturday, the 18th, there are two events. There will be a bird walk at the Clear Creek wastewater treatment plant, Saturday, October 18th at 7:30. And the other event is the annual return of the Salmon Festival at the Coleman National Fish Hatchery in Anderson. We, the Shasta Birding Society, will have a table at the return of the Salmon Festival, and we would love to have some more volunteers. The timing for the festival is 9 to 3, and if you can come for a couple of hours, meet festival attendees who are interested in birding. We usually have volunteers do 2-hour shifts. And then the final event is a big birding day adventure to the North Spit Jetty and Arcata Marsh over on the coast on Saturday, October 25th. All of these adventures are on our website, shastabirding.society.org, and they include ways for you to sign up, ways for you to volunteer for the return of the Salmon Festival, and directions for where to meet trip leaders for those various events. So come on down and see some birds with some other people who love them. And now to the evening's program, I'd like to introduce Rebecca De Guevara, who is a co-chair of our Birding Society's Conservation Committee. One of the things you'll find when you go onto the website are regular reports from the Conservation Committee about both federal, state, and local activities that affect birds and other parts of the natural world. Those where we are taking positions and those where we may not take a position but think you'll be interested. Rebecca is also on the board of Audubon California and the Superior and chairs the Superior California group of Audubon societies around the North Coast. And it's my pleasure to turn this over to Rebecca, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Catherine. And yes, in our programs, we have the presenters. And I am so glad to present this speaker tonight because I'm from LA. I moved up here a few years ago, and hence my connection with the UCLA folks who love birds as much as we do. And that's how we ended up getting Dr. Morgan Tingley to talk tonight. And so I'm very honored. Thank you so much, Dr. Tingley. And Dr. Tingley is a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. In this lecture, He's gonna discuss the myriad ways that fire has shaped the ecology of birds and how the shifting nature of fire is impacting biodiversity. By learning how species are currently responding to a rapidly changing world, we are offered a glimpse into what our increasingly flammable future will hold. So please welcome Dr. Tingley.
I think someone just stole the share screen away from me. I will see if I can take it back.
The share screen back.
Does that work? Great. So thank you all for joining me on this Wednesday evening. It's actually fun to hear about your field trips. I did my PhD at UC Berkeley, and all my field work was in the Sierra. Actually, I spent 2 years doing a lot of work up in Northern California, including doing field work at Manzanita Lake itself. So I know that area all very well, and Lassen in particular is just like one of my favorite parks in the country. But I'm here to talk about fire. Fire in the Sierras, actually, I'll be talking about a fair amount, as well as fire close to home. I'll be talking about fire, the way that it benefits our landscapes, but also the way that it potentially harms our biodiversity. And I know, particularly talking to a group from Northern California, that there is no way that everyone in your audience has not been touched by fire in some ways. And maybe some of you have lost your homes, or friends have lost your homes to fire. And so I like to start talks by acknowledging that. If you're interested, if you go back 10 months or so, and if you look out the window to my left, you would have seen this, which was my view of the Palisades fire on January 6th. And that is about a 400-foot towering inferno that's blazing about 3.5 miles away. So thankfully, it blew the opposite direction of us. But it's all of us who live here in California are impacted by fire. And I acknowledge that, even though I will be spending the rest of this talk talking about how fire impacts birds in particular. So I want to go back in time a little bit and think about like how fire is changing here in California. And I lived in California in sort of the early 2000s, moved away for a long time, and moved back in 2019 when I joined at UCLA. And in 2019, I think I produced this plot, which I was showing to people when I was interviewing at UCLA, about how fire is changing in California and how we were starting to see this evidence that maybe not in the frequency of fires increasing, but if you actually looked at the area burned in California, you could see how things were starting to increase. But this graph ends in 2016. And if you just extend the axis a little bit farther into the future, what I didn't know was, that maybe in sort of a few years after, there'd be some big fires, but then in 2020, we had this huge, abnormally massive spike in fire. So in 2020, we burned 4.3 million acres here in California, which is an area about the size of New Jersey. 2021 was almost 2021 would have been an exceptionally high year for fire if it weren't for the fact that it just followed 2020 that really broke all these records. But 2021 was 2.6 million acres. There's been work by another scientist here at UCLA, Park Williams, who has shown through a lot of climatological and simulation work that we would be having increasing wildfires right now in 2025, even in the absence of climate change, through the combination of fire suppression and how we've managed our forests, and the increased ignition and the way that humans have built into areas where we're likely to cause fires. We would have increased fires even in the absence of climate change. But with climate change, with drying of the environment and warming of the environment, we're burning about twice as many acres as we would in the absence of it. And so when you hear the news arguing about what is the role of all of these things, it's really hard to attribute any certain event to climate change. But we do know that it's having a particularly strong impact. And that's not to say that necessarily it's the frequency of fires, but it is the impact of individual fires, whether or not they take off, whether or not they really spread from maybe a small spark or small ground patch that could be put out easily to a huge conflagration that's consuming millions of acres. I said that 2020 was a bad year, and if every year is as bad as 2020, then every inch of California would burn every 25 years. That fact is not all that honest, because not every inch of California can burn. We have lots of places that don't burn, and plus asphalt and water. So if we actually only talked about every burnable, that is a forested inch of California, if it was bad as 2020, then it would be every 15 years. And so all of this is hopefully to show you what maybe you already know or have realized in some ways without maybe the verbiage, is what fire ecologists call our fire regime, and it's changing. And so when we talk about the fire regime, we talk about all of the different aspects by which fire occurs naturally in an ecosystem. And that includes this average severity of fires, it means the frequency of fires, the size of fires, and the seasonality of fires. And California is an ecosystem that has been having fires for millions of years. Our trees are adapted to it. Our birds are adapted to it. Our ecosystem in many ways is very tied to fire and needs fire. But that doesn't mean that necessarily all fires are healthy or beneficial for the ecosystem. And what we've been seeing is shifts in all of these things, that fires are becoming more frequent, they're becoming larger, they're becoming more severe, and they're also occurring in parts of the year where fire historically has not occurred as much. I'll just point out that this graph here in the lower right shows that the fire season in California is really predominantly in July and August, into a bit in September, and then historically we would have fall rains that would come that would end the fire season. And if those of you who remember are in Los Angeles, our fires this year that were catastrophic were in January. And so this fire season is really extending way, way, way into the fall and the winter, usually through the delaying of winter water. So what do I do as a scientist? Well, I pretty much am interested in how birds respond to fire and what that means and what our changing fire regimes mean for biodiversity. And I study this in two ways, and I'll be talking about both of those. One of those ways is what happens to birds during fire. And the other way is what happens to birds after fire. And what happens to birds after fire is kind of what ecologists have been studying for decades. And it's what I've been studying for most of my career. I've been studying birds responding to fire for the last 15 years. Well, birds respond during fire is actually much, much more recent of a phenomenon. Until about 5 or 6 years ago, people weren't even thinking about it. I started thinking about it in about 2021, so I'm relatively new to it. And it turns out there's very, very little that's been known. I'll tell you kind of what we do know, but it's certainly something that we're learning more about. And I think actually when Rebecca asked me to give this talk in the first place, it's because she's been involved in a monitoring program that we're using, I'll talk about in a bit, that is trying to understand what happens to birds during fire. And the reality is that we have to start these really large citizen science-based approaches because it's just really hard to study and we don't know very much. So one of the things we do know, unfortunately, to some extent, we just don't know numbers, is that fire kills birds. That's not entirely surprising. Fire is extremely hot. It can move really fast. It produces lots of carbon monoxide that can asphyxiate animals that are in close proximity to fire, including humans, but certainly birds trying to escape. But because it's so hot, we don't really find carcasses. People actually do go and survey in areas that have burned, and sometimes they will find carcasses of mammals and things like that. But birds, because their bones are so light and full of air pockets, they burn really, really easily. Maybe you've stuck chicken bones in a fireplace. They carbonize quite quickly, and so it's really hard to find remains. I use this photo, and I know it's kind of grisly, but this is a rainbow lorikeet, which is a very colorful type of parrot found in Australia. And in January 2020, Australia had one of its worst fire seasons ever, called the Black Summer of 2020, is how they refer to it in Australia. And this was a photo that was taken on a beach. And so this was a rainbow lorikeet that did not burn. It did not burn in the fire. It undoubtedly was fleeing the fire and asphyxiated in the air as it escaped. But because these fires were going down to the ocean, it didn't fall, it basically fell into the water and then washed ashore on the beach in addition to all of this carbonized tree vegetation. And this is just to say that we know that fire kills birds, we just don't know how many. But aside from the fire itself, aside from those flames that are localized, and we know that where fire occurs, if it gets really hot and really severe, that it can lead to the loss of animal life. The other real concern that I've been increasingly become interested in is the impacts of smoke. This is a photo that I took from an airplane flying south, actually not too far away from you all. I was flying from Alaska back to Los Angeles, and this is the Dixie Fire, which was burning through 5 different counties and ended up burning over 1 million acres in August of 2021. And even from 35,000 feet, the smoke plume coming off the Dixie Fire was incredibly evident. And you can see that the smoke was joining in with a lot of other fires that were burning in August of that time, creating an almost universal layer of smoke in the atmosphere, in the lower atmosphere. And smoke is really interesting in that way, in that, even while we have a lot of fires throughout Western North America every year, this is just a screen capture I took back in August of all the fires that happened to be burning at that moment on that day, August 10th, in August of this year. Fires themselves ultimately are localized, right? These icons are kind of big, and they're overemphasizing actually how much spatial area was burning at this time. And so fires, although they're localized and they can cause loss of life, they're not as widespread as the impacts of smoke. This is a layer showing the smoke that was covering North America on that exact same day from all those fires. So obviously there's smoke throughout here in Southern California and parts of the Southwest near all those fires. But then there's a lot of smoke that was coming from Northern Western America and into Canada that was billowing its way through Eastern North America. And so wildfire smoke is this interesting thing where obviously you can't have smoke without fire, but just because there's smoke there doesn't mean that there's a fire nearby. And so smoke is a really interesting disturbance that no one has really thought about from an ecological and biodiversity lens until quite recently. And as I said, I started thinking about this in 2020, 2021. And as someone who'd been studying the impacts of fire, I was like, how come no one's studied this? How come no one's even looked at this question? And so I came across a paper that was published that year in 2021 that was published by a woman who was finishing her PhD at the University of Washington named Olivia Sanderfoot. And she published a really good scientific review. That is to say, it's a paper without data, but it's a paper that is integrating and summarizing and reviewing all of the scientific literature that had come out at that time. And this was a summary slide from that paper, which is basically saying that wildfire smoke is expected to have short-term habitat changes due to the fire itself and the smoke itself, but also will produce gases and particulate matter. These things can lead to health effects and behavioral responses, which we'd expect to have impacts on survival, reproductive success, growth, and development that can lead to population-level impacts in impacting ecosystems. And this was basically laying out everything we might know from anyone who'd studied this on any species across the world. But the lesson from this paper that was published just 4 years ago, there was state of the art summarizing everything we know, was that we don't actually have very much data. What we have was a lot of hypotheses about, we think that smoke should have pretty wide ranging impacts on the environment, but we don't have much data. But at the time, people were starting to think about smoke and worry about what smoke's impacts might be. One of the sort of catalyzing events was actually the year previously in September. And I said September was a really bad year for fire in California, that in August and September, there were so many fires that were burning caused by a lightning storm in August of 2020. that it caused huge amounts of smoke to go through the Rocky West. And there was this phenomenon that occurred over a week in New Mexico, which was a mass bird die-off. Now, mass bird die-offs don't happen all that frequently, but they do happen from time to time around the world. But what people discovered, particularly in the first few days as they were walking in natural habitats, this is a photo. It's not a great photo, but it's a photo taken on a riverbank where you can see that the ground is just littered with the bodies of dead and dying birds, mostly aerial insectivores, a lot of swallows, a lot of warblers, vireos, species like that would have been migrating at that time. A group of scientists out of New Mexico State started actually trying to collect these species, document this die-off, and eventually do autopsies. What they found, and they presented on this at a conference this summer, so I got the most up-to-date science on it, was that there's no evidence that these birds died from smoke inhalation itself, but they all showed evidence of being emaciated and being underfed. They had been starving as they were migrating, and that combined with unusually cold conditions led them to basically die en masse. But the hypothesis is that actually something probably disturbed their migratory behavior. It might have actually stopped them from going to a stopover site. They may have essentially foregone foraging or the avoided conditions, very possibly due to smoke at that time. Another interesting study that helps us understand smoke impacts was an anecdotal study that was happening just through monitoring. And this was a study looking at Tule white-fronted geese that spend their winters in the northern Central Valley, not too far from you. And these Tule white-fronted geese spend their summers breeding up in Alaska. And then every fall, they will migrate down. They will stop. They basically they fly over the ocean for a bit, then they come in near the Olympic Peninsula. They make their way down through Oregon. They all meet up at this place called Summer Lake in Southern Oregon. Maybe you know it. They spend maybe a week or so there. They refuel, they re-rest, and then they make the rest of the final voyage down to the Central Valley. So these blue lines are GPS collars that were placed on a handful of birds that sort of tracked what this migration looks like in 2019. So this is what a typical migration looks like. These birds are flying, more or less following the same path. They're communicating with each other. They're stopping over at Summer Lake before they make it to the Central Valley. This is what it looked like in 2020. And the red in the background is smoke at the time. And these tracks of the individual birds are in yellow. And what they found was that these birds encountered smoke and did all sorts of things to try and avoid it, but ended up being unable to avoid it and ended up becoming quite disorienting, which sort of caused all sorts of problems for their migration. When they first hit the smoke and they were over water, their first instinct of the flocks was actually to fly higher and higher to try and fly above the smoke. As if it were ground fog or something like that. Unfortunately, they were not able to do so because the smoke was through the air column. So eventually they kind of gave up and they flew through it. There's evidence that they possibly got a little lost. And so for periods of time while they were over water before they hit land, they actually just landed on the water and rafted on the ocean for a bit, trying to sort of regain their orientation before taking off again and starting to fly. By the time they made it into the thickest smoke in the middle of Oregon, they had become essentially more or less dissociated and disoriented. One of the birds ended up getting so lost that it started flying to the northwest and spent about a week on the Idaho border, just kind of by itself, before eventually finding its bearings, regaining enough fuel, and flying off back south. In total, the migration took 2 times as long as the normal migration did. And while none of the birds actually died that were tracked, there was evidence that at least some of them actually died on the way through mortalities that were reported. We've been starting to study smoke impacts in my lab, but it's really hard to do. The thing about smoke is that we cannot predict where it will occur and when it will occur. And it's highly variable day to day, even in some cases hour to hour. And so from a typical scientific perspective, You kind of just have to be out there monitoring, looking for impacts, ready for smoke to be out there. So we've been trying to use a lot of data sets that are long-term monitoring data sets to study this. We were approached by scientists at the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory out of near Palo Alto, who have a long-term bird banding data set that, unlike most bird banders that will only work seasonally, SFBBO actually bands birds all year long, weekly, in a systematic way. And so they actually gave us like 20 years of data and said, see what you can find. And so we used this really long data set of birds in the fall to look at how birds responded to 20 years of periodic smoke influx. And one of the most powerful things we could do was that since they were out there banding every week, we could actually look at birds that have been captured in 1 week before smoke. And then the same individuals were recaptured after smoke, right? And so this is kind of like a classic experimental treatment. And so we could imagine that, it's like going to the doctor's office, being measured, and then changing your diet or being exposed to something or starting a new exercise regime, and then going back to the doctor and being measured again, and they can control for every individual's intricacies to actually understand that impact. So we were able to do this with these birds that were caught, and we could actually look how their body mass was changing after different amounts of smoke exposure. And what the general result that you can see in this plot is that an individual exposure to 10 days of unhealthy smoke would decline in mass by 1.7%. In this 10 days of unhealthy smoke is a pretty low threshold. And so the threshold we're using is particulate matter of 3.5 microns or smaller, that it was greater than 35 micrograms per liter. This is a quantity that you're probably not aware of. But PM 2.5 of 35 is enough smoke in the air to smell it. Like you can walk outside and you kind of can smell smoke, but it's not enough smoke for you to see it. That's a much higher concentration of PM 2.5. And so this is a threshold that the EPA has said is unhealthy for chronic human exposure. And so that's why we picked it. But PM 2.5 threshold of 35 is pretty minor. And so during these really major health impact smoke events, we know that birds are getting a much greater exposure. So this is some of the work that has just come out of my lab with my students. We are continuing to have stuff come out. Hopefully, I just submitted some research to a journal 2 weeks ago that we're really, really excited about. But one of the reasons that I'm here is I know Shasta Birding Society has been helping me in this is with an ongoing citizen science project called Project Phoenix that we've been running. This is now the 3rd year. Project Phoenix is really just getting people who like to watch birds to go out and collect systematic data once a week in the smoke season, which we have been describing as July 1st to November 15th. And so it's really just picking someplace that you know and you like, probably your yard or a park near you, someplace that's easy to access. And all we ask is that you go there once a week for 10 minutes and submit an eBird checklist during that time. And so we've tried to keep the actual input, the amount that we're asking from people to be small. And yeah, we are asking for 10 minutes of your time every week, but hopefully if it's someplace easy, like I just go outside with my coffee on Saturday or Sunday mornings and I do the checklist in my yard, and I find it kind of relaxing and part of my my weekly routine. But by having, in this year, actually, we've been able to grow the group of people who are participating to over 2,000 volunteers across California, Oregon, and Washington. We've been able to we're now sort of studying. We have this data set that's growing where everybody's out there weekly collecting, doing 1 10-minute point count for us. And that allows us to look at where smoke is, where smoke isn't, and how that changes the abundance of birds, so we can start to understand how species move, how they respond, whether or not they are hiding from smoke, or they're avoiding from smoke, are they migrating away from smoke. And it's just like such an important topic, but it's really, really hard to study. And so if there are any of you, I know Rebecca is, but if others of you who who've been helping along with this, thank you, because these data are just really, really useful, but really hard to get. So to summarize this part of my talk about how do birds respond to fire, what I'll say is that active flames and heavy smoke can have negative impacts on bird populations, but it's really hard to study and we have very little numerical data. It is something that I'm spending a lot of time trying to work on and to build. And if I come back and talk to you again in another 4 or 5 years, I hope that I can not just devote 15 minutes to this topic, but I could actually devote an entire hour or two to tell you about all the exciting research that we've done. What I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about is work that I've been doing for much longer, for about 15 years. And is work that in some ways should be close to your home, because a lot of it is taking place in Northern California, in Lassen and Plumas, counties in particular. And this is studying how birds respond after fire. And so this is working in landscapes that I love and hopefully you love as well. This is taken in the Moonlight Fire. That was primarily in Plumas County. So this was taken 10 years after the fire. You can see that a lot of the trees that initially were killed by the fire have actually been fallen down or had their tops break off. The undergrowth is huge. The landscape is, still shows the long-term impacts of a high severity fire, but it is full of birds and it is full of life. And one of the species that I've spent a long time studying here is one of my favorite birds. And I know someone in the audience early on got excited when they saw a photo of it, which is the black-backed woodpecker. And black-backed woodpeckers, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is the most fire-reliant bird species in North America. And in California in particular, if you want to see a black-backed woodpecker, you are best going to a fire, or a spot of land that has burned in the last few years. They are pretty abundant in recent burns. You can see them nesting. They nest almost exclusively in dead and dying trees caused by fire. And one of the reasons they are in these areas is because these dead and dying trees are just gigantically full of these huge grubs. You can see how big this grub is in the adult's mouth. These are grubs of wood-boring beetles, primarily of the families Buprestidae and Cerambycidae, that colonize these trees by the millions, maybe billions, almost immediately, or at least in the weeks after a fire starts to kill those trees. And so I've been really lucky and fortunate enough to work with an NGO, the Institute for Bird Populations, as well as the U.S. Forest Service since 2009. I'm going to have to change this slide. The Forest Service canceled this project after 15 years. And so the last year of data collection was 2024. We hope to maybe revive it at some point in the future if we can find ways to fund it. But it still is a really amazing, important data set. And what we did starting in 2009 was every year we would go to 50 fires that had burned in the Sierra Nevada over the previous 10 years, and we'd survey them across about 10 to 20 different survey points, looking not just for black-backed woodpeckers, although that was specifically what we were doing playback surveys for, but we also would do all bird point counts to look at the full biodiversity. And you can see that we've studied fires all the way up to the Oregon border, all the way down to the southernmost extensive of the greenhorns and the Kern Plateau. Overall, we've found over 150 different bird species in these burned areas, and we've conducted over 3,000 survey points. And a lot of this is to study the long-term population dynamics of black-backed woodpeckers. That's where the money was coming from, as a species of special concern and as an indicator for healthy post-fire environments. And so every year I would crunch numbers. This is not a complete map through the most recent time period, but I'd crunch numbers and do models to look at how the population trends of black-backed woodpeckers were doing in California. And while there's year-to-year variation, in general, actually, it just kind of stays more or less somewhat level. But if you actually look at any individual fire, not the population in California as a whole, but if you actually looked at an individual fire and said, well, how are woodpeckers doing in this individual fire? You actually would see a really characteristic response, which is that if you look at the number of years since the fire occurred, somewhere between 70 and 80% of sites within these fires would have woodpeckers in them if the fire was 1, 2, or 3 years old. But starting about 4 or 5 years after fire, the populations just start to drop off. There's far, far fewer blackback woodpeckers. And by 10 years after fire, we've basically halved the number of woodpeckers. And some other people who study even longer time periods generally say that once you get to about 15 years after fire, you're just not going to find a blackback woodpecker. But if you go to one that is 1, 2, or 3 years after fire, you're definitely going to find one. So time since fire, and this is not new for this species, but time since fire is the most important factor governing colonization and persistence at all spatial scales in these fires. The most important thing, if you want to find a blackback woodpecker, is to go to a fire that has burned as recently as possible. Not weeks, but months. This was what we kind of knew going into this project. It was good to study it, but the big question is why? Like, what is going on? What explains this pattern? And what is the biology of the species that is leading to this? And so one of the first things we did was we started going into these fires of different ages and actually catching individual blackback woodpeckers with nets and trying to age them. And so we have actually able to age them based off of the plumage of their wings and the help of Peter Pyle, who's amazing at this, to actually age birds into different age classes, second year, third year, after third year, fourth year, after fourth year. So multiple different hierarchies of ages. And what we found was that basically old fires had old birds and new fires had young birds. So if you go to a fire 1 year after it burned, it basically has birds. It has blackback woodpeckers in it, but they're all in their first year of breeding. Like they just found that patch over the winter and they're in it for the first time. Whereas if you go to a fire that's 8 years after it has burned 8 years ago, all the birds are over or 5 years old or older. And so this relationship suggested to us that, okay, if we want to study the dynamics of blackback woodpeckers in California, the only thing that matters is juveniles. That all that matters is the juveniles that are being born, what they're doing, and where they're going. Because this is what ecologists see as the evidence of juvenile dispersal. Juveniles are being born, they are leaving and going off and colonizing new areas. In our model, our conceptual model here was that basically a fire had to have been colonized by a juvenile blackback woodpecker. Otherwise, blackback woodpeckers wouldn't find it. So this meant we actually had to go and try and find juvenile blackback woodpeckers, and we had to see where they went. So to do that, we went into fires. We would track adults. We would find their nests. And then we would monitor their nests every day to see sort of what was going on. We'd observe them from afar with binoculars to see how old the nestlings were after they'd hatched. And then eventually, about 1 day before we expected them to fledge, my PhD student, Andrew Stillman, would climb up this double ladder that was held belayed with four ropes so that the ladder did not touch the tree, because if the ladder touched the tree might fall. And so we had to rig this system whereby he could climb up a ladder and go into these nest holes, pull out the blackback woodpecker babies, ready, almost fledglings, attach radio transmitters to them, and then put them back into their hole. It was a delicate procedure, but Andrew was a trooper, and we were able to do this for a bunch of different nests. And that allowed us, starting a day later, to have all of these adorable little juvenile blackback woodpeckers that are running around with radio transmitters hanging off their backs. And these radio transmitters allowed us to actually follow them for their first year of life and to see where they go. This meant a lot of running around in the mountains by Andrew with a backpack, a hard hat, and a radio transmitter trying to chase these woodpeckers as they explored the world. Eventually, they started to go too far for us to manage to find them on foot. So we actually had to go up in ultralight planes, and we actually had a lovely group of nonprofit pilots, primarily working out of Susanville, who would actually take Andrew up and fly him around while he listened for his woodpeckers. A lot of work, but this allowed us to try and actually answer this question of where do they go? And so we were able to follow 19 different individual blackback woodpecker babies in their first year of life to figure out where they went. Of those 19, 7 out of the 19 actually left the fire they were born in and moved to a different fire. Each of these plots are just examples showing essentially their natal fire where they were. These dark gray blotches are fire scars on a landscape. The light gray is just anything that's not a fire scar. And you can see this individual was born in this part of a fire. We did not find it in the fall of its first year, but then it ended up going in breeding in a different fire the following year. This individual down here at the bottom, it started in one fire. In November of that first year, we refound it in a second fire. But by May of, we found it actually breeding in a third fire to the north. And so it was prospecting across the landscape, trying to find a great place to breed. 4 out of the 19 actually ended up settling in unburned forests. Often what they were still finding were disturbed forest patches, often killed by beetles or something, but this was a minority of the individuals. And then the remaining 8 of the 19 settled in the fire they were born in. Some of them actually kind of went out onto the landscape and looked for other types of habitat, and that's where we found them in the fall, before eventually returning to the fire that they were born in to breed. Overall, we tracked juveniles that were moving up to 50 kilometers from where they were born. So they're actually covering a fair amount of landscape. But many individuals we actually could not be located. So I just presented data on 18, but there's probably another 18 that actually we ultimately could not find. And we did a lot of experiments to see how well we could find these. And we were pretty good at finding them, even by plane. And so our estimate is actually they probably even left our study region. And so that means that they dispersed greater than 50 kilometers, which is a lot for a woodpecker that's actually not such a strong flyer. And we also looked at whether or not they were likely to leave the fire they were born in. And what we found was that the strong relationship between the age of the fire and whether or not they left that fire. And so if they were born in a fire that was more than 3 years old, they always would leave it. They would always go someplace else. And so when you go into fires that are 4 or 5 or 8 years old and you find blackback woodpeckers in there, those are probably blackback woodpeckers that have been in there for many years, holding territories and breeding. But their young are not staying. Their young are going off and spreading throughout the landscape, looking for better habitat and more recent burns. And we also therefore found that they would travel farther if they were born in an older fire. You might ask, well, are they actually seeking out fire on the landscape when they're leaving and they're moving around? We did a lot of statistics that I won't bore you with, but all I'll say is that 78% of the woodpeckers we tracked settled in burned forest. If you actually just picked a random expectation based off of the amount of burned forest on the landscape in these areas and the expected dispersal distance, you'd expect only about 10% of them to actually settle in forest if they were not settle in fire if they were not seeking it out. So we're pretty sure that they were. And more importantly, what we found out was that they were just leaving old fires and moving to these younger fires. So hopefully I've convinced you from this that, at least from the perspective of a blackback woodpecker, there's something special about fire. You know, there's something unique. And so this has led to us thinking about this concept that we're going to call pyrodiversity. And pyrodiversity is a relatively new concept, and it's a fancy scientific word. But we can describe it as the temporal or structural diversity of fire. And so fires burn in different ways across landscapes, and the different way that fires burns will have different ecological impacts. And so I like to show and illustrate biodiversity using an example of the Rim Fire, which burned down near Yosemite, including parts of Yosemite in 2013. And so this is a map showing the actual temporal daily burning pattern of the Rim Fire. And so it actually started in this little pink blob where my cursor is on August 17th. It didn't grow very much on August 17th. On August 19th, it burned to the south, creating this yellow patch. But then on August 21st, it basically reversed directions and expanded all the way in this green patch. So clearly that is the weather changed, the winds changed, it became dry, the winds became strong, and it became a uncontrollable crown fire that was burning straight through large amounts of land. And so this temporal pattern by which the fire burned translates to severity on the ground. So this is a false color image showing burn severity, which then gets classified into a percentage of trees that die. And so the green areas are where less than a quarter of the trees are dead. The dark red areas are where over 3/4 of the trees are dead. And so you can see really strongly that correlation between the temporal pattern and the fire severity pattern that occurs afterwards. But if we look at fires as a whole, we look across different fires, every fire has its own kind of unique fingerprint, which is burn severity. Depending on topography and fuels and weather, fires burn with different severities in different ways. And then this leads us to actually think about, well, what is the diversity of these severities? And that is what we call pyrodiversity. And so we can think about that both across fires, but we can also think about that within fires. So low pyrodiversity is where you don't have a lot of mixture, spatial mixture of these habitats. So like an area that burns up here, where at all low severity, or an area that burns here at all high severity, that's low pyrodiversity in either way. Whereas these areas where you have a mixture, habitats of high severity bordering lots of unburned habitat, this is what we call high biodiversity. You can think of this as just having a lot of different habitats all coming together, influenced by fire. And almost 10 years ago, I published a big paper showing how bird diversity is higher in biodiverse areas of California and the Sierra. That if you go into these habitat patches where you have more structural variation in burn severity, you're just going to have more bird species. And we can explain that partly just through what you as birders know, which is that different birds like different habitats. So if you go into an area with an intact canopy, you're going to find a western tanager. But if you go into a high burn severity where all the trees are dead, you just have these snags, you might find a Lewis's woodpecker. But if you go into an area where these habitats are in close neighbors to each other and are intermixed, you actually might get both. And so you might have more species in areas where you have this greater diversity of habitats. But there's also, this doesn't explain sort of phenomenon of species that are really tied to fire, like blackback woodpeckers. And so one of the things we wanted to study was like, well, how does, biodiversity and this phenomenon impact the species that is supposed to love fire so much, right? We know that blackback woodpeckers love fire. That's what I've been telling you. So the first time we looked at this, we started using a data set from up near you in Northern California, where we spent 8 years doing nest monitoring of blackback woodpeckers. We had data from 118 different nests. We monitored them every 2 to 5 days. And we looked at what factors determined the nest site selection of these blackback woodpeckers. We did this at multiple different scales. And we found all sorts of different responses. We found that they were more likely to build their nests in areas with high burn severity, with high snag density, at intermediate tree diameters. They would build their cavities lower on the trees than at random. And in general, those cavities would be facing east so that the babies could be warmed in the morning sun in the cold mountains. But one of the interesting things about this, most interesting to us, was this relationship to distance to edge. That even though they were selecting to build their nests in really high severity burns, they would choose to build them not in the middle of the burn patch, but they would actually build the nests right along the edges. And so how close they were to low severity or unburned edge was really important for actually determining where they were selecting to build their nests. And this was a really interesting result that confused us, and it also kind of flew in the face of a lot of the conventional wisdom about this species. So we had to sort of leave the nest tracking alone and go back to our actual physical tracking, looking at how juveniles use the landscape versus how adults use the landscape. And when we were looking at tracking of juveniles and adults, we actually found that they were using very different habitats. The juveniles were using the basically unburned or low severity habitats that look like this picture on the top, whereas the adults were using the heavily burned areas where all that food was. But even if you then look at the actual spatial pattern, you can see each of these black dots is just an example for a single individual of where it is found on the landscape. You'll see that even though they're using these individual habitats, they're still using the edges of those habitats. So this individual adult was just going along the edge of the high severity, hitting all those trees, rather than using the central part of this patch. And part of that makes sense because these fledglings are reliant on their parents. And so the fledglings would be staying in the middle of these areas with intact live trees, and they just would be hiding there and hanging out there all day long. Their parents wouldn't go too far away, but they'd go into the high severity patch. They'd get lots of grubs, they'd get lots of food, and then they'd meet up together on the edge where the adults would feed the juveniles some food. Because they actually would stay together for about 3 to 4 months of parental care after they fledge. But more importantly, it's because we were tracking all these individual juveniles, we actually found that they survived much more if they didn't go in the high severity. That if juvenile blackback woodpeckers, if we looked at their 35-day probability of survival, it's not great. It's a hard life as a baby blackback woodpecker, but they have about a 50% survival chance if they go in any habitat other than high severity. But if they spend the majority of their time in high severity fire, they have less than a 20% chance of surviving. So this area, even though these high severity areas are where they're born, where their adults spend the time, where their parents spend their time, and where all the food is, these areas are very, very dangerous for them. Why are they so dangerous? It's because baby blackback woodpeckers are not very mobile, and they can be eaten anything. So because we were tracking them, we had radio transmitters, we could follow them around, and we could eventually find where they died. And so we found these radio transmitters in the nests of all sorts of raptors. Basically, any raptor that exists in this area, from like a red-tailed hawk to a goshawk to a sharp-shinned hawk, all the way down to a western screech owl, which is basically the same size as a blackback woodpecker. We found a blackback woodpecker transmitter in a nest of this western screech owl. This is a photo we took. So anything that can get their claws on a blackback woodpecker would eat it. But this explains why we had this really interesting distribution of the species and why we weren't finding them in the middle of really high severity patches. Ecologists and behavioral ecologists call this concept the landscape of fear, where the introduction of predators and the relationship between predators and prey influence how prey actually uses the landscape. And so in our context, kind of similar to this example of wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone, the open burned forest is a beautiful place to get food if you're a blackback woodpecker. But it is also, there's no place to hide, and you are a sitting duck or sitting woodpecker. And so instead, they retreat, the juveniles that are kind of clumsy and they're getting fed by their parents anyway, they retreat from these areas and they go back to the living forest that hopefully is nearby. And that shelter that you get from that line of unburned forest is a shelter is sort of obviously known to the species, because that's why the adults are actually choosing to build their nests really close to those edges as well, so that when they're helpless young fledge and leave the nest, they don't have to travel that far to get to some place to hide and to be safe. So what we learned from this is that while fire and biodiversity has more species, and this can be done for what we call resource partitioning, or that just means that different birds like different habitats, there's also this landscape of fear impact, that it's about how species actually interact with the landscape in a way that can make a species like the blackback woodpecker that just absolutely loves fire, it can mean that even a species like this is really strongly negatively impacted by strong, large patches of high severity fire. So the lesson we had from this is the blackback woodpecker, even though they love fire and we don't find them all that often outside of fire, what we've been seeing in recent years is this trend of these mega fires, where you have these huge, large, high severity forest patches where everything burns. And when we do surveys and we go looking for blackback woodpeckers in those high severity patches, we don't find them, or we find them at much lower abundances than we'd expect. And we now know why, from their biology and from their natural history, they're not in those areas, even though there's lots of dead trees that should have lots of food. It's just not great habitat for them because they are too, the predation rate is too high. And this is not great news, right? So we started studying blackback woodpeckers because we were wondering about how their population was changing over time, and it seems relatively stable. And obviously, there's plenty of fire on the landscape. And many people have asked me, well, why are we studying blackback woodpeckers at all? With more fire, of course, they're going to be fine. But the reality is the type of fire that we're getting now is not the same type of fire that we got 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And that might not be great, even for species that really like fire, like blackback woodpeckers. So the question that I work on is, well, what's the future of biodiversity in Western forests and Western landscapes? And the answer is I still don't know. We're working on it. We have learned a lot about how species respond to fire, but there's all these other questions like how species respond to smoke that we don't know. And so I'm going to finish in 30 seconds. But what I'll finish with is something that I never ever used to do, but I've had to start doing it, which is to say that if you like this talk and you like the research that I presented, we could use your help. I know I heard from the start, the announcements that your society is active in thinking about decisions that affect conservation of birds. And I don't think it's any surprise to say that that basically science funding has been decimated over the last 10 months. And basically there is no science funding anymore, particularly not funding for people who study anything outdoors and anything involving nature and biodiversity. So fire, climate, all of this stuff is not funded. It's funded maybe at the state level. California is doing its best. But that cannot make up for about the $1 trillion a year that was going to do science across North America. So this is a QR code. I'm going to have it here on my thank you slide. It goes directly to a link that allows a tax-deductible deduction to UCLA, which I know maybe you might not want to give to UCLA, but I will tell you that that link goes directly to me and my students, not my wallet. It goes directly to a research fund that I use to fund my postdocs and my students, PhD students, undergrads, who are all doing really important bird work and conservation. So that's my pitch. Thank you for listening and showing up on a Wednesday, and I am really more than happy to take questions. If people online on the Zoom wanted to put questions in the chat, I'm happy to read them there. If you're here in person, yeah, just get close to a mic.
Mic is on. You can hear us still, right?
I can hear you when you stand close to that computer.
All right. So questions here? I'm not seeing any. Will I see what?
So your QR code here is to get more information on helping that information be spread, right? Getting updates.
Did you hear the question? Does the QR code, will that allow people to find out updates on the research?
The QR code is just a giving link, unfortunately. That's a great suggestion. I do have my personal lab's website down in the lower left, which is easy enough. It's myname.com. And I do post publications and stuff there. If you want to join Project Phoenix, I don't actually have the QR code for that on this slide, but if you Googled, Project Phoenix is actually a little hard because there's a lot of Project Phoenixes out there in the world. But if you Google Project Phoenix UCLA smoke, those terms will get you to our website, and you can sign up, and we send out a week